Good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you very much for being here. I am delighted to talk to you about an experience that I have had at Universidad de Caldas. So my talk is called Using TEACCH to Teach English to Students with Special Educational Needs. Thank you very much again for being here. So this is the agenda for today. First of all, I would like to give you some background of this pedagogical experience slash research study. Then I'm going to tell you what authors I have read, and I'm going to review a couple of concepts with you. Then I'm going to talk about the study. Afterwards, I'm going to describe the preliminary findings that I have had so far. And finally, I'm going to give you some conclusions. So as I said, this is the agenda for today. So first, I'm going to give you a description of the background in which this pedagogical experience and research study has been carried out. Then I'm going to describe some theoretical concepts with you. Afterwards, I'm going to describe the study. And after that, I'm going to talk about some preliminary findings I have had so far, and finally, the conclusions. Okay, so this is the background. This pedagogical slash research study has been carried out at Universidad de Caldas, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, with a population that comes from an extension project called Escuela de Inglés para Estudiantes con Necesidades Educativas Diversas, EINED. This is a project that I created last year, and we basically teach English classes to students with autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and Down syndrome. So we have been working online because of the pandemic, and we offer 2 hours of English classes per week. I also coordinate another project at Universidad de Caldas called CineDay, which is a semillero de investigación. And in this semillero, we have students and teachers from the foreign languages department. So some of these studies that we have been carrying out are done in conjunction with the EINED project as well. And finally, I'm going to tell you about the implementation of a method called TEACCH as an alternative to teach English to students with special educational needs. So I think it is very important to start this literary review with the TEACCH method. And afterwards, I'm going to tell you a little bit about special educational needs, especially about the conditions that I'm working with at the moment. So I'm working with students who have autism spectrum disorder, others with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or with double diagnosis, and finally students who have Down syndrome. Okay, before I move on to the actual literature review, I would like to review one concept with you, which I think is really vital in this process. And this concept is the concept of reasonable accommodations or reasonable adjustments. According to the World Health Organization from 2011, they believe that inclusive education entails identifying and removing barriers and providing reasonable accommodation. Then later on in 2013, the Colombian government took out a law called Law 1618, in which they talked about the disabled people's rights. And again, they mentioned the concept reasonable adjustments. So I wanted to start with this because basically TEACCH method or the TEACCH method is a method which can offer opportunities to do reasonable adjustments with students with special educational needs. What kind of accommodations? That's what I would like to tell you at the moment. But before, I would like to give you very, very brief description of the method. So the method was actually created by Dr. Eric Schopler in 1972. He is a professor from University of North Carolina, and they started the method in order to help students with autism. But later on, they realized that it was very useful to work with students who have related communication problems because it promotes structured learning environments with a focus on visual learning. And this actually helps children or students with a range of disabilities. So let's have a look at the principle which underline this method. So first of all, we can talk about the physical structure of the classroom. Secondly, consistency in schedules. After that, we're going to talk about the establishment of expectations, then maintenance of routine, and finally, implementation of visually based cues. So let's have a look at each principle in more detail. So first of all, let's talk about the physical structure. As we all know, I'm pretty sure we all know that working with special educational needs students is not an easy task. It can actually be a very challenging task because you have to think about many different things. And what we have done as teachers, and quite rightly so in my opinion, is to look for different strategies, right? Depending on different approaches. But actually, I think that TEACCH is a method which can contain a variety of strategies all together in one single method. So let's begin talking about the structure of the classroom. As I said, it's not an easy task because you have to consider room arrangement, chair arrangement, the objects that you have in the classroom, etc. So what's the idea? The physical structure refers to the individual surroundings or environment. So it is important to actually define clear physical boundaries for all the day's activities, because that will give confidence to our STEM students. Those physical boundaries are clearly defined and usually include activities like work, play, break time, and transitioning between the activities, which is a really difficult task for a student with special educational needs. So I'm going to give you an example of spaces in a classroom. This was taken from kindergarten school. So the idea is to label of the objects that you have in the classroom, hopefully with words and also pictograms or images. This is another example of organization of a space in which you can keep your resources. I mean, this is in Spanish, but you can have everything in English as well, because the image is there to reinforce the words. This is another picture that I took, which I quite like because you can see that there is not much clutter in this classroom and everything seems to be very organized. So this is the idea of an organized classroom. The thing is, obviously in Colombia, our classrooms are not like this, yeah? Or perhaps in some public schools, right? So I quite understand that in public schools, we have the challenge of organizing the classroom, but the idea is to try to modify the spaces with whatever we have at hand, yeah, especially in order to minimize clutter and disorganization so that our students with SEN can be more focused. The second principle is consistency in schedules, really important for students with SEN, because a schedule or planner indicates what the person is supposed to do and obviously when it is supposed to happen. And the thing about this is that if a student have a schedule or a planner, that will again give them a lot of confidence, reassurance, and they will feel that things are going to be okay because they manage a lot of anxiety. So the person's entire day, week, and possibly month should be clearly shown to the person through words or photographs or drawings or whatever medium is easiest for the person to comprehend. Of course, it is up to us to know our students well so that we know exactly which kind of support they need. For example, in our English classes at our school, we always give them the starting time and the ending time. So we always say our class starts at 4:30 and finishes at 5:30. We give them another reinforcement of Spanish every now and again. Every time we start an activity, we also tell them, for example, this activity is going to last for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and so on. And that really helps them. Another idea is to give them the whole timetable for the classes per week. And if you find it useful, they can even have their own individual schedule. This can actually help reduce triggers, reduce crisis, and reduce anxiety. Principle number 3, establishment of expectations. Again, I think we should, as teachers, we know that we should establish our expectations to everybody at the beginning of a course, at the beginning of a year, at the beginning of a semester, at the beginning of a day even. So this is very important for everybody, really, not only for students with SEN. But for SEN students, it becomes a paramount aspect. So these expectations may be behavioral, because, okay, you can tell them, okay, today I would like you to behave well. Please do not disturb other people, do not disrupt the class, etc. Or those expectations can be activity-based, could be academic or just for communication. But having a clear set of expectations makes it easier for a parent, for a caregiver, for an educator, for a therapist, yeah, for all of us to set up consequences or interventions when the expectations are not met. Because in that way, they are going to be clear that if an expectation is not met, then there will be a consequence, either negative in this case, yeah, or the opposite. If an expectation is met, they will have a positive reward. This principle also includes activity measurements, because the goal is to set up the child for independent work and functioning as much as we can. Of course, it depends on the disability and also depends on the level of severity of that disability. But the idea is to help them or to lead them through independence and high functioning. The work system should be organized in such a way that the person has little or no difficulty figuring out what to do. That is why our instructions should be really clear. But we can use things like these, which I found quite easy, but actually quite useful. For example, having a folder in which they know exactly what activities to do and they can complete them when they finished. Another activity is, or another idea is to have something like this, in which they put on one side the activities that they need to do, and on the other side the activities that have been finished, or something like this, which is actually quite similar, in which they know what work to do, how much work to do, when they are finished, and what is going to happen next. Because let's remember something else. Anticipation is key when you're working with special educational needs students, because they are always very eager to know what is happening next, even if they haven't started an activity. So having that in one place will help them a lot. Okay, if these activities seem quite difficult to manage in a group because you have too many students, for example, the idea is just to have an agenda on the board with the activities that they need to do, and you can just cross things out as soon as they finish, yeah? Or while they are doing an activity, when they finish, you cross them out, and then that will give them a sense of achievement as well, which is very important. Principle number 4, maintenance of a routine. Students with special educational needs, especially if you're talking about students with autism, students with ADHD and Down syndrome, because of my experience, I can tell you that they definitely need a routine. Otherwise, again, a trigger to an anxiety tantrum can appear. So the idea is to set up and maintain a routine if possible, right? For example, people with autism typically thrive on consistency. But I have also realized, because of my experience with the students and because of this research study, that the students with ADHD and Down syndrome also need consistency in routines and they thrive. So when something that is outside of their routine actually that can cause them to withdraw or become uncooperative for the activity or event if we haven't anticipated that change in advance. So it is very important to keep routines, to maintain them, to let them know what is happening next, but also to anticipate in case of a change. Okay, sometimes there are things in the classroom that cannot be anticipated, and I totally understand that. But the idea is to try to anticipate things as much as possible if there is a change in routine. Every now and again, we also need to change that routine again with correct and appropriate anticipation. Why is that? Because actually, the majority of students with SEN are very inflexible. So we also need to teach them how to be flexible. But we can do this again, every now and again, slowly, gradually, until they can understand that sometimes things don't go as planned. So some examples of routines, for example, the main one is to always have a school timetable in which they know exactly what classes they have per day. It can be accompanied by pictograms or drawings. Remember that most of them are very visual. But this is vital. Again, in the class, we need to have the steps of the class clearly defined, hopefully in a place that everybody can see it. So starting for a warm-up or activity number 1, activity number 2, final activity, or any lesson plan format that you actually want. For example, in our school, we use the 3Ps method. We start with a warm-up, then we have a presentation, then practice and production. Why do we use this one? Because of the experience we have had, and again, with the research studies that we have been conducting, we have realized that the 3Ps method is a very structured method. Okay, for some people it's very conventional, but for us, it has actually been a really useful method because students know exactly what is happening next. They know that there is always a warm-up based on a game, an activity, flashcards, a video, a song, etc., followed by the presentation of the topic, again, in an attractive way. Afterwards, we have a practice activity. We start with a controlled practice exercise and then a more freely led exercise. And finally, we have the production in which they produce in the language, as the name says, and they also have some kind of manual work, because we have realized that these kind of activities increase their ability, their motor skills, either fine or gross motor skills. Okay, but even if you don't follow the 3Ps method or any other method, the idea is to always have an order in the class so they know exactly what is happening next. And finally, the last principle is the implementation of visually based cues. Again, vital, because most of them are visual learners. So that visual information could be written on paper or on a computer. Yeah, it could also be drawings, pictograms, graphics, for example, graphic organizers if you are at secondary school, or even with the youngest one, you can use them. And color is very important. I would always recommend warm colors if you are presenting new vocabulary, because according to some color studies, warm colors have an impact on the retention of vocabulary. So warm colors like yellow and red and orange are amazing for retention of vocabulary. If you are thinking about decorating your classroom, the idea is to use the opposite kind of colors. For example, cool colors like gray, blue and green can actually be really helpful to decorate the classroom. So these are some examples of visual aids that we can use. We can use posters with problem-solving steps or routines, color-coded schedules and folders, flashcards with pictograms, real images, graphic organizers, and if we have the possibility of bringing realia to the classroom, that is even better. Example of pictograms. Generally we present the vocabulary in different ways. So we use pictograms with words, or we use real images. So we have association activities with these kind of resources. We also have association of real images with words, or we give them a pictogram with the word and then they have to give us the word with just reading the pictogram. Or for example, here there is a three-way association in which they have a real image, a word, and then a pictogram for them to actually match. Same here, where you have the pictogram and then they have to match it with the word. Or a more difficult exercise in which you give them, for example, a situation, and then they actually have to match it with a place. For example, in this case, hi, my name is Paulo and I'm at school. I need to go to different places. Can you help me, please? And then, excuse me, can you help me? These are the pictograms for that. I need to study. Where can I go? Until they say, I need help. But the other person says, yeah, no problem. You can go to the library. Okay, so the idea is to always give them loads and loads of visual cues for them to use vocabulary or expressions or even sentences. Okay, very quickly, I would like to give you a brief review of some conditions, especially the ones that we are working on at our project. So I'm going to talk to you about autism spectrum disorder. That's the first pictogram. The second one is ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And the final one is Down syndrome. Autism spectrum disorder. So it is a neurological and relational disorder, which has two main features. Number one is restricted repetitive behavior, and number two, deficit in social interaction and communication. Perhaps the second one is the most noticeable one. They also have problems with executive functioning. So executive functioning are basically functioning skills, are basically all the skills that we need to operate on a daily basis. So they are skills like planning, organizing, memorization, prioritizing, etc. So that's why it's complicated for them to do all these activities. They also have a problem with theory of mind, which is basically the shared perception we have of others. So it's quite difficult to understand cues, visual cues or gestures that for other people are completely common. For them, it's complicated to understand subjective feelings, for example. And finally, central coherence is also complicated because they cannot get the whole picture, because they have a very detailed memory. So they are only looking for details, small details. And finally, sensory processing. It's also very complicated because they receive stimuli from the senses in a very inappropriate way, let's say. So all the things that they perceive through their senses comes in really complicated ways. So the messages can be misunderstood. And finally, students who are in the AS are predominantly visual learners. This is according to Leibarger-Monson 2017. So it is important to remember all these features because actually students with ADHD share some of these as well, which is quite interesting. That is why I believe, or I claim, that this method can be useful for students with different conditions because basically they can tackle the same difficulties. So for example, students with ADHD have problems with executive functioning as well, and also with self-regulation disorder. That is why students with ADHD have so many problems to stand still. They have low working memory and lack of executive functioning skills. They need assistance in organizational and time management skills, so they can become a disaster in terms of managing routines, managing tasks. They also have a lot of problem transitioning between the activities. And finally, they have lots of difficulties in social relationships with their peers, unfortunately, because they are concentrated in what they want, in what they are going to do. So this is not very well taken by their peers. And finally, students with Down syndrome or T21 as it's called, have problems with slow processing, again, with decoding of information because they are very literal, the same as students with ASD and ADHD. They have a very short attention span. They have difficulty to retain what is heard. That is why we have to give them input in different ways. And they have a lot of difficulty to follow instructions. So the instructions have to be really short and have to be accompanied by other resources like visual cues. They have lots of problems with language development, actually more so than students with ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. And finally, again, they are mainly visual learners. This is according to Ruiz 2009. As you can see, the three conditions share similar features. That is why we can use the strategies from this method to tackle these difficulties and help them out. Now, because of all these aspects that I have been mentioning, I thought about a research question for this study, which is, what is the impact of the implementation of TEACCH on the performance of special educational needs students in the English class? And I'm going to describe the background of the study. I'm going to give you the context, the participants, the approach of this study, and finally, the methodology I used. So the context, as I said to you, the students come from a project from Universidad de Caldas called ANED, in which we offer online English classes twice a week because of the pandemic. We have a mixed class of 14 students who have ASD, 6 students with Down syndrome, and 4 students who are double diagnosed with ADHD and ASD. The ages vary quite a lot. We have students from 7 to 36 years old, and we have different severity levels. By this, I mean that we have students who are nonverbal and who are very low functioning, and we also have students who are high functioning, and they come from various strata. Now, the approach I've used for this study is a mixed study in which I combine quantitative and qualitative data, and I do the analysis of data through a set of instruments. I said I do because this is a study in progress. I haven't finished yet. So methodology. So I decided to do some stages, 4 stages, in fact. The first one was a diagnosis stage in which I assessed the performance of the students so that I have that in mind in order to compare it with the performance they have after the implementation of all the strategies. Number 2, I implemented a number of strategies from each one of the principles from TEACCH, the ones that I've mentioned to you today. Number 3, I analyzed data through the implementation of a few instruments that I will tell you in a moment. And finally, I have some preliminary findings so far, but obviously at the end of the implementation, which is going to take until next year, I'm going to have more findings and conclusions. So the data collection methods I used are, first of all, a teacher's diary. Afterwards, I used a class observation checklist and parent surveys. As I said to you, some of the students are nonverbal, so actually having the parent survey was very important. Now, the preliminary findings. And I'm going to take the next 5 minutes to talk about the findings I have so far and the conclusions of this study. So first of all, in my opinion, the implementation of visual cues have had a positive impact on the students' retention of vocabulary. I said in my opinion, but I can also tell you that they come from the analysis of the surveys we have had with the parents. Number two, students have become more confident to participate since they feel reassured with their routines, because they know exactly that we have the PPP methods, that the activities have a certain time, that they last for, I don't know, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, that is always the same order. Basically, they feel more reassured. Students are developing more independence and self-regulation through the use of TEACCH strategies, because actually the fact that they have all these activities and all these strategies in place have actually helped them to control themselves more, especially students with ADHD or students who are double diagnosed. And finally, from this slide, we can tell, or I can tell, that students have become acquainted with the working system and their anxiety levels have decreased. Now, the preliminary findings, some more. Students' oral production has increased through the use of visual aids such as pictograms and images. In fact, I also implemented sign language, but that is something that is going to come at a later stage. Students are clear of the expectations set for each class. Definitely at the beginning of the class, we always tell them in terms of behavior and in terms of academic achievement. Next, parents have reported the progress of students since they are using English outside from the classes. So actually the parents are happily surprised that they are using the words and the expressions outside from the English class. And that's really rewarding for me as well. And finally, the conclusions. TEACCH can be used to teach English to students with a variety of conditions, not only students with autism spectrum disorder, because if you remember, what I told you at the beginning was that TEACCH was initially thought to help students with ASD. But actually, now we can say, and the TEACCH creators have actually said that it can be used with students with other conditions. Number two, having a structured working system like the one TEACCH proposes allows our SEN students to be focused and self-regulation, because the idea is that through the TEACCH strategies, we can minimize distractions. Number three, majority of students with SEN are predominantly visual. So that is why the implementation of visual cues is vital. And finally, TEACCH has a positive impact on students' performance since it develops a set of life skills, which facilitates the learning process, because basically these strategies can be used in different areas of their life. So the strategies are not only useful for teaching English, really, they are useful for them on a daily basis. Thank you very much for your attention, for being here. This is my email, and these are the references. And please let me know if you have any question. Thank you very much.